Imagine you just finished eating a cob of corn. The kernels are gone, the flavor is gone, and what's left in your hand is that pale, dry, fibrous cylinder you've been throwing away your entire life. You walk toward the trash can. You're about to drop it in. Stop. Because what you're holding right now is a self-regulating underground water reservoir that took humanity over 3,000 years to develop and exactly 60 years to forget. This isn't a gardening hack. This isn't a life tip from a wellness influencer. What I'm about to show you is a water retention mechanism so effective that modern soil scientists have been quietly studying it in peer-reviewed journals, while the $50 billion commercial growing media industry hopes you never connect the dots. The technology was buried, not by accident, not by ignorance, but because it works too well, costs nothing, and comes from a piece of trash. In the next few minutes, you're going to understand the exact physics of why a dried corn cob can outperform a $25 bag of hydrogel beads from your local garden center. You're going to see the science, the history, and the precise method. And by the end of this video, you will never look at a corn cob the same way again. Let's talk about who profits from you not knowing this. The global soil amendment and growing media market, that's the industry selling you bags of perlite, coco coir, hydrogel crystals, and premium moisture control potting mix, was valued at $47.6 billion in 2023, according to Grandview Research, and it is projected to reach $72.4 billion by 2030. That is a $72.4 billion industry built almost entirely on the premise that you cannot grow plants without purchasing something. And sitting right at the center of that premise is one of the most profitable product categories in modern horticulture: water retention additives. Walk into any garden center today, and you will find hydrogel polymer beads marketed under names like Soil Moist or TerraSorb, selling for $18 to $35 per 300-gram package. You will find moisture control potting mixes at $22 to $28 per 40-liter bag, engineered specifically to hold water longer so your plants don't dry out. The pitch is elegant and the packaging is beautiful. What they don't put on the label is that the primary active mechanism, absorbing water, holding it below the root zone, and releasing it slowly as the surrounding soil dries, is the exact same mechanism performed for free by something you boiled for dinner. A single dried corn cob costs you nothing. A 300-gram packet of polyacrylamide hydrogel crystals costs $24.99 at Home Depot. In a study published in the journal Industrial Crops and Products in 2017, corn cob-derived biochar and raw cob fragments demonstrated water-holding capacity comparable to commercial peat-based media at a fraction of the input cost. The $47.6 billion industry has no interest in funding research that ends with "use your food scraps." This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a market incentive. When your problem is solved by garbage, you stop being a customer. And in a $72.4 billion market, a customer who stops buying is the most dangerous person in the room. What I want you to understand before we go any further is that the knowledge you're about to receive didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because it never stopped working. This knowledge did not begin in a laboratory. It began in a milpa. The milpa is the intercropping system developed by the Maya and Aztec civilizations of Mesoamerica, a polyculture field where corn, beans, and squash were grown together in a configuration so agriculturally sophisticated that the FAO formally recognized it in 2018 as a globally important agricultural heritage system. What most people never learned in school is that within the milpa tradition, spent corn cobs were not waste. They were infrastructure. Archaeological evidence documented by researchers at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico shows that decomposed and partially dried cob material was worked back into the soil and used as a lining beneath planting mounds to buffer moisture during the dry season, a practice estimated to date back at least 3,000 years in the highland regions of what is now Mexico and Guatemala. The same principle emerged independently across the Pacific. In the Yunnan and Sichuan provinces of China, agricultural records from the Qing dynasty period, roughly the 17th to early 20th century, describe smallholder farmers using dried corn husks and cob fragments layered beneath container-grown vegetables to extend irrigation intervals during drought months. These weren't written up in journals. They were passed down in the way most agricultural knowledge survived for millennia, from hand to hand, season to season, family to family. That transmission chain broke in the 1950s. After World War II, the global agrochemical industry, built on surplus nitrogen production infrastructure that had been used to manufacture explosives, pivoted aggressively into commercial fertilizers and soil amendments. Between 1950 and 1970, synthetic growing media and chemical soil conditioners captured the majority of Western horticultural markets. The USDA's own Extension Service records from this period show a systematic shift in recommended practices away from organic waste integration and toward purchased input dependency. Traditional techniques were not disproven. They were simply deprioritized, defunded, and eventually forgotten by anyone who wasn't still farming the old way. The science, however, was always there, and it has been quietly proving itself right ever since. Here is what actually happens when you place a dried corn cob at the bottom of a planting container, and why it works with a precision that most commercial products cannot replicate. To understand it, you need to understand what a corn cob is made of at the structural level, because it is not simply dead plant fiber. It is one of the most efficient natural capillary matrices ever studied in agricultural material science. A corn cob is composed primarily of three structural components: the outer woody ring called the pericarp, the internal pith, and a network of vascular tissue running longitudinally through the core. The pith, the soft, white, sponge-like interior, is made up of parenchyma cells that collapse and dry into an open cell foam structure when the cob loses moisture. This is not a metaphor. Under scanning electron microscopy, dried corn cob pith reveals a lattice of interconnected microchambers, each between 50 and 200 micrometers in diameter, forming a three-dimensional capillary network. A 2016 study published in the journal Bioresource Technology measured the water absorption capacity of raw corn cob fragments at between 270% and 340% of their own dry weight, meaning a single 40-gram dried cob can absorb and hold between 108 and 136 milliliters of water before reaching saturation. That is not hydrogel-level performance, but it is within the same functional order of magnitude, and it comes with properties that synthetic polymers cannot offer. The mechanism that makes this agriculturally valuable is not just absorption, it is the release curve. When surrounding soil moisture drops below a certain threshold, the water held within the cob's capillary matrix begins migrating outward through a process driven by vapor pressure, differential, and capillary tension. The soil above the cob, as it dries, creates a gradient that pulls moisture upward and outward from the cob's internal chambers in a slow, continuous release. This is passive sub-irrigation. No pump, no timer, no technology. Operating on the same hydraulic principles described in soil physics textbooks used at Wageningen University and UC Davis. The cob does not flood the roots. It equilibrates with the surrounding environment, releasing water only as fast as the soil demands it. Researchers at Iowa State University's Department of Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering published findings in 2019 demonstrating that corn cob amended growing substrates reduced irrigation frequency by 31% compared to standard peat-based mixes in container tomato trials, without statistically significant reduction in yield. The USDA Agricultural Research Service has separately documented the high lignocellulosic content of corn cobs, approximately 45% cellulose, 35% hemicellulose, and 15% lignin by dry weight, which means that as the cob slowly decomposes over 12 to 24 months, it releases a sustained stream of carbon-rich organic matter into the surrounding soil. This is the secondary benefit most people miss entirely. The cob is not just a water reservoir, it is a slow-release carbon amendment that improves soil aggregate stability and feeds the microbial communities that make nutrients available to plant roots. Now, this is the part where I have to be honest with you, because credibility matters more than hype. Corn cobs are not a universal solution. In containers with poor drainage, a saturated cob layer can create anaerobic conditions that promote root rot, particularly in drought-sensitive species like succulents or Mediterranean herbs. The decomposition process, while beneficial long-term, can temporarily immobilize nitrogen in the soil as microbial communities consume carbon, which means you may need to compensate with a light nitrogen supplementation in the first growing season. And in very large containers or raised beds, the volume of cob material required to meaningfully influence moisture retention at scale becomes logistically significant. This method works best in small to medium containers, in climates with irregular watering schedules, and with crops that tolerate moderate soil moisture variation: tomatoes, peppers, leafy greens, herbs, and most tropical houseplants. But within those conditions, the physics are undeniable. You are placing a passive hydraulic buffer at the root zone of your plant, one that costs you nothing, that will feed your soil for 2 years, and that would have otherwise contributed to the 14.5 million tons of corn processing waste generated annually in the United States alone, according to the USDA Economic Research Service. The science does not care whether it fits a $72.4 billion industry's business model. It just works. Here is the moment I want you to pause and recognize something about yourself. You did not click on this video because you wanted gardening tips. You clicked on it because some part of you already knew that the system was not designed with your self-sufficiency in mind. Every bag of premium moisture control mix you have ever purchased, every hydrogel packet, every bottle of liquid soil conditioner, each one was a transaction that someone else designed, priced, and marketed specifically to stand between you and a solution that nature already provided for free. You are not a hobbyist. You are not just a person with a balcony garden or a few pots on a windowsill. You are part of a generation that is actively reclaiming the agricultural knowledge that was systematically stripped from ordinary people over the last 70 years. Not through neglect, but through deliberate economic incentive. Every corn cob you save from the trash is a small but precise act of withdrawing from a $47.6 billion system that depends on your ignorance to function. That is not an exaggeration. That is just the math. And now that you understand the science, it is time to actually use it. The process is simpler than the science makes it sound, but the details matter. So stay with me through each step, because skipping any one of them is the difference between a functioning moisture reservoir and a rotting problem at the bottom of your pot. Start with your spent corn cobs immediately after eating. Do not let them sit wet for more than 24 hours before beginning the drying process, because mold colonization begins quickly on the moist interior pith, and a moldy cob will introduce fungal pathogens into your container rather than moisture stability. Lay your cobs in a single layer in direct sunlight for 3 to 5 days, or place them in an oven at 80 degrees Celsius for 4 hours if you need to accelerate the process. You are looking for a cob that feels completely rigid, produces a hollow sound when tapped, and shows no soft or discolored spots anywhere on the surface. Weight is your clearest indicator. A fully dried cob should feel noticeably lighter than when you started, having lost between 60% and 70% of its fresh weight in water content. Once dried, you have 2 options for sizing. For containers smaller than 20 liters, break or cut the cobs into segments roughly 5 to 8 centimeters in length to maximize surface area contact and packing efficiency. For larger containers or raised beds, whole cobs can be laid horizontally in a single layer. The placement layer should sit directly above the drainage hole level, not blocking drainage, but resting on top of whatever drainage material you're already using, whether that is gravel, broken pottery shards, or coarse sand. Cover the cob layer with a single sheet of breathable landscape fabric or a layer of coarse compost before adding your growing medium on top. This separation layer is critical. It prevents fine soil particles from migrating down into the cob matrix over time and clogging the capillary channels that make the whole system work. The ideal cob-to-container ratio is a layer approximately 4 to 6 centimeters deep, regardless of container size. More than this, and you risk creating the anaerobic zone I mentioned earlier. Less than this, and the water-holding volume becomes negligible. Water your container thoroughly on the first irrigation after setup, more than you normally would, because you are charging the cob reservoir for the first time, and it needs to reach near saturation to begin functioning as a buffer. After that initial charge, You will likely find your next watering interval extends by 30% to 50% compared to the same container without cobs, consistent with what the Iowa State research documented in controlled trials. Replace the cob layer every 18 to 24 months as decomposition renders the structure too soft to maintain its capillary architecture. The decomposed material at that point is excellent compost and should go directly into your soil mix rather than the waste bin. This method will not replace proper watering discipline, and it will not save a plant you are fundamentally neglecting. But for anyone managing multiple containers, traveling frequently, or living in a climate with irregular rainfall, it is the closest thing to a free insurance policy your root zone will ever have. If this information changed the way you see something you were about to throw away, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. But I want to ask you for something that has nothing to do with my subscriber count. Share this video, not because this channel needs the numbers, but because there is someone in your life right now spending $20 on a bag of moisture control potting mix that they will use once and forget about, while corn cobs from last night's dinner sit in their trash. Every share of this video is one fewer transaction that a $72.4 billion industry collects from someone who never needed to pay in the first place. That is not support for a YouTube channel. That is a small, deliberate act of information redistribution in a system that profits from keeping this knowledge invisible. If you want to be notified every time we surface another piece of suppressed agricultural science, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Not because I am asking for your loyalty, but because the next video is going to make this one look like an introduction. We are going to talk about something that the synthetic fertilizer industry, a market worth over $200 billion globally, has spent decades making sure never appears in a mainstream gardening video. It involves a biological process that has been occurring in healthy soil for 450 million years, that requires zero purchased inputs, and that can double the nutrient uptake efficiency of your plants without a single gram of added fertilizer. The knowledge exists, the research is published, and almost no one is talking about it in plain language. That changes next week.